Hey everybody, this is a different course. This is based on a pet project of mine that I started in 2020 when we were all kind of given more free time than we probably needed during the course of the pandemic. And so I decided that I wanted to attempt to write a book on the history of the mental health asylums and institutions. Because it seems to me that you can buy a book on history of particular institutions and specific hospitals, but there's no real definitive history of the system in and of itself. And so I thought, well, I can't find a book that I would like to read about the history of the mental health institution system. Maybe I should write one. And so that's what I did over the course of about 2 years. I actually kind of started before the pandemic. I originally started the first drafts of the manuscript in 2018 and decided to get back to finishing it during the pandemic, which I did finish it in 2021. Sent it off to publishers with no, what would you say? I didn't have any luck trying to get the manuscript out there. And so it's just kind of sat on my junk drive collecting dust. Well, that's a figure of speech because it's on a jump drive. So it's not like I have a stack of paper literally collecting dust. And so as I was putting together my lecture series for Psych 101, I thought, how about take this pet project and turn it into a class? Because it's something unique. It's a completely different topic than your run-of-the-mill psychology 101. Like there's so many of us that are teaching about Freud, Jung, and the psychoanalysts and all of that, but every professor with his or her salt should have like their signature course that's theirs. And so this is an attempt to have a signature course that's mine and mine alone that might generate some interest, which I'm hoping it will do. It might generate discussions in the comments, which would be kind of cool. And it's a way for me to really kind of approach this in a lecture type way. So that's what I'm hoping to aim with that. So this first lecture is called Welcome Home, Origins of the Asylum. It's based off the preface of the book where I wrote, I put Welcome Home, and it's a nod to Metallica's song Welcome Home Sanitarium. It's one of my favorite tracks off the album. And interestingly enough, I turned this song into a worksheet for group therapy with my clients when I worked at the psychiatric hospital because it's one thing for us to sit here and think about mental health hospitals or insane asylums or state hospitals, and as anybody that's outside the field of psychology, anybody that's outside of psychiatry, people that aren't patients, we have this archetype built up of these big, large, imposing Gothic structures with all these horror stories and ghost stories. And I mean, the asylum has captured the collective imagination of most people. I mean, you think to Batman and the Joker's always taken to Arkham Asylum. Arkham Asylum was not just a location in DC Comics with Batman, but was also the location of a mental hospital in I forget what part of Massachusetts when H.P. Lovecraft wrote his Cthulhu mythos, and Arkham Asylum was one of the places he fleshed out in his books. And several bands in the heavy metal genre explored thoughts of that. I mean, you had, I want to say Annihilator was the name of the band. They wrote this song Alice in Hell about a lady who had mental illness. And of course, Metallica wrote Welcome Home Sanitarium, which explored their perceived ideas of what it would be like to be a patient in a mental hospital. And of course, if you watched paranormal TV shows like Ghost Adventures, Ghost Hunters, Project Fear, they have investigated the old abandoned mental hospitals of yesteryear, of the 1800s. And of course, the mental hospitals come with their own mythology. And all of the mythology is rooted in reality in some sense. You always hear about the lobotomies that have left people zombified and have had horrible side effects. Rosemary Kennedy, suffering from bipolar disorder, was given a lobotomy and ended up with a traumatic brain injury that left her with intellectual disabilities as a consequence of that. Or you hear about electroshock therapy and how it was so barbaric, yet in one of the lectures when I talk about it in the abnormal psych/psychopathology course, I talk about how it's still used today in rare cases and is much safer today. But shock therapy, lobotomies, the padded rooms, these large Gothic castle-like structures where you imagine people muttering to themselves and pacing back and forth, screaming. Like, these are the things that come into the imagination. And it's part of the collective mythos of the insane asylum. And so I wanted to write this book that was going to explore the mythology but grounded in reality. And I kind of talk about how we got there and where we're going since the days of deinstitutionalization. So that's what this is about. It's about to explore that. So welcome home. Welcome to where time stands still, where no one leaves and no one will, as James Hetfield soulfully sang in the first few lines. Well, welcome to the Origins of the Asylum lecture into the history of mental health institutions, and hopefully this will generate enough interest that maybe this will be a class that I can work on presenting and making better every year. And that's the goal, depending on where we're at with this first lecture. And please feel free in the comments to let me know what you think, because I don't think there's a course like this out there. I don't think there's any videos like this out there. So I think it would be worth it to explore this and see where it goes. So let's get into it. So the learning objectives for at least this lecture is I want to define asylum historically and culturally. I want to trace the early humanitarian motives behind institutional care and identify the nature, of refuge and imprisonment, because there is a duality that is present when you think about places like this. You think of the word asylum, you think of safe place and refuge. I mean, I'm not here to make any political statements, but you hear a lot of agitation about, immigrants coming into the United States seeking asylum or seeking safety and refuge. And that was the idea behind the mental hospitals. They were supposed to be a safe place and a refuge where someone could go get stabilized and be safe and not be in harm's way, not be a danger to themselves or to other people. And so that's really where that idea of asylum comes from, is that safe place or that refuge. However, as any system goes, the longer it's around without sufficient updates to it goes sideways very, very rapidly. And what happened with the idea of moral treatment and safe place and refuge, it turned into overpopulation, barbaric treatments. And I'm not here to defend it. I'm going to state plainly that a lot of the things that we know now are because of the mistakes that were made in the past. And a lot of the mistakes made in the past were not initially made out of malice. There's a philosophical tool, and the name escapes me, but it's don't attribute to malice, which is easily explained by incompetence or stupidity. And you have to think, it's 2025. We're 100 years removed from, psychoanalysis and other therapeutic modalities coming to the forefront for treating people with severe mental illness. I mean, medication has only been really used to treat psychosis and bipolar disorders between the 1950s and 1960s. That's not even 100 years. Psychoanalysis was the first therapy that was seen to work for people with mental illness, and that was in the 1890s. So 1990, which was 30, 40 years ago, that was 100 years prior to that. So I mean, you got to think in if you look at the totality of human history, right? That's only a blink of an eye. That much progress in that short amount of time, even though it doesn't seem like a short amount of time. But when you look at the establishment of the mental hospitals and asylums in the late 1700s to the early 1800s to where we're at today, there's at least 150 years of that it went from safe place to confinement and warehousing and hiding people away. And so when you think of it that way, it's like, well, no wonder these places have a bad reputation because, we're empathetic, compassionate creatures and we don't like to see people suffer, but obviously outrage can manifest itself when you see people being mistreated or at least mistreated from our perceptions of things. But you have to realize in the historical context things were a hell of a lot worse before they got better. And I think that's human progress in a nutshell, is things typically get worse before they get better. And so keeping that in mind, and hopefully you guys will keep an open mind as we walk through this, that maybe perhaps the goal of this is not to um, maybe not defend horrible mistakes, but maybe create some understanding and, maybe provide some additional context. Because, one of the things I do get upset about when I watch like these ghost hunting shows is they always talk about the mental hospitals as these horrible, terrible places. But having worked in one, it's like, actually, we're doing better than they did 100 years ago. It's not perfect. The systems are broken. I don't know what else you can do about that other than try to fix things as best as you can and realize that you're going to have unintended consequences as you go about that. But ultimately, we're all trying to do our best here, and that's all we can do. But that's the goals for at least for this lecture, is to define asylum, trace the early humanitarian motives behind institutional care, and identify the duality that exists within the nature of the asylums, which is refuge versus imprisonment. So let's talk about this. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, we saw asylums emerge. So you could think of that as anywhere between the 1780s up into the 1860s, and is when we started to see these things kind of pop up, right? And they emerged as a part of a progressive social reform, which aimed at a specific thing, that was to separate the mentally ill from prisons and poorhouses. So what does that mean? Well, prior to the first mental hospitals emerging in Europe and the United States, I think the United States was about 40 to 50 years behind Europe in the establishment of them. If someone was mentally ill, they were automatically thrown into a prison or jail, or they were thrown into the poorhouses. Poorhouses were set up for folks who, well, they were in poverty. They couldn't take care of themselves. They couldn't afford a house or food or anything like that. And many times it was widows with orphans, and so you'd have these, young women with these young children. They're poor, and they would live in these poor farms with this residence, this house or building that they would stay in. Of course, they'd go out and they would work the farms, and because they worked on the farms, they were able to, have food. It was like a charity thing. It's like, if you come and work and help us cultivate the land, you get to partake in what the land gives. It's kind of like it's a new way of thinking about, you reap what you sow. If you go out and you work in the gardens at the poor farms, the food that's grown, you get to eat that. You don't get charged for it. You don't get to pay money for it. You're basically providing your own food, but you're being provided through charity, a roof over your head, a bed to sleep in, and someone to help you with watching your children. And it wasn't just for poor widows with orphans. You would also see alcoholics, epileptics is what they call them. So people with seizure disorder, people with alcohol abuse disorders, and you would see the mentally ill thrown in there. And sometimes mentally ill people, especially if they're floridly psychotic or acutely manic and unpredictable, violence would happen, people would get hurt, these things would happen, and as a consequence of that, they would probably be removed. In fact, many cases they were removed from the poor farms and they were sent to jails and prisons, and because we didn't, when I say we, the psychological community in psychiatry at the time, the medications weren't there to get people stable, so pretty much what do? You go to the poor farm, and if you get thrown out of the poor farm, you go to the prison, and if you go into the prison, you're going to be unmanageable. You're going to be the victim of brutality in places like prisons and stuff like that, and it's not a good environment for that. So the Quakers and other social reformers at the time in the mid 1700s, they thought about, well, what about asylums? What about safe places that we could house people with severe mental disorders? Of course, back then they called it neurosis or madness, lunacy, moon sickness. That's where the idea of lunacy comes from. And so they thought, okay, well, how about we build places for them and we get them out of the prisons, get them out of the poor farms, and they can be in that place, and we can have people that can take care of them and make sure that they don't hurt others or hurt themselves. Sounds like a good idea, but at the time, with no working knowledge of human psychology or how the mind works, you're pretty much just taking a problem from one place and you're putting it in another place surrounded by people with similar problems. And so, seems like a good idea at the time. But of course, as we'll go through this course and we talk about the history of the institutional systems, you can see where things went off the rails very, very rapidly. One of the lectures we're going to really focus on is Bethlehem Hospital in England. That's where we get the term bedlam from, and if you've ever heard the term absolute bedlam or bedlam at all, it basically means chaos and disorder. And that's exactly what the hell was the consequence of throwing a bunch of people with different mental disorders in one place, and you just did the best you could and hoped for the best that you could hope for. And of course, what you hope for and what actually happens, a lot of times they aren't the same thing, as we'll come to find out as we go through this. But that was the idea of having, emerging asylums, was instead of places like the poor farms from charity and going into confinement in the jails and prisons, well, let's get them out of the prisons, out of the poor farms, and we're going to put them in these central buildings, and we're going to call them asylums because that's what they are. In fact, many of the state hospitals and mental institutions we're going to talk about started off being called lunatic asylums. Safe place for lunatics, safe place for what they labeled mad. Now luckily we don't still call people lunatics or mad. We just they're mentally ill. They have mental disorders. They have mental illness, and we should think of it as no different than having a bodily somatic disorder or somatic illness. It's just the brain, and the brain controls just about everything we do and everything we think, and it controls our emotional responses to things. And so, yeah, I've probably rambled on about that a little too much here. So let's go to the next slide where we're going to talk about early humanitarian ideals. So early reformers believed that asylums could relieve suffering and restore sanity through structured environments and moral treatment. So what did they mean by that? So prisons have a structure where you have people in a cell, and that's where you're going to be held until you've paid your debt to society for the crimes that you've committed. Whereas in the lunatic asylums, well, what they would do is it's a structured environment. We're going to have you have activities. You're going to be able to work on the farms. You're going to help keep the place clean. You're going to have things to do to keep your mind busy, and through that we can help restore you to sanity, because you can at least act out the behaviors associated with being a well-adjusted person. And moral treatment involved fresh food, sunlight. That's why one of the first architectural, what would you say? One of the first architectural models for the insane asylums were on the Kirkbride plan. So when you think of the archetypical asylum, you think of the large Gothic imposing structure that's going to have these bat wings that are going to go way out in the building. So they're going to be like 2 or 3 city blocks long. And the idea with these staggered batwing-like structures was that it was structured in a way that it maximized the flow of fresh air and sunlight. And that was part of the moral treatment of the insane, as well as giving them activities such as working in the gardens or cleaning the wings and the rooms and working in the laundry and doing sewing and engaging in these vocational activities that we would call, I guess you could say that that was a precursor to what would become occupational therapy in the future. And so these occupational activities, fresh food, fresh air, plenty of sunlight, and they would even take into account the way that they would paint the rooms. So if you've ever been in an old mental hospital, if you'll notice, they were always painted these like bright pastel colors. They were considered soothing colors or calming colors. So even the paint on the walls of the inside of the institution themselves was part of what was called moral treatment. And so all of those things are taken into consideration on how they were going to treat the mentally insane at the time. And I think it's important to note when we say insane, it's not a diagnostic term. Nobody is diagnosed insane. That is a misconception of the highest order. Insanity is a legal term, and it means that someone is sufficiently mentally ill or disabled intellectually that they cannot tell right from wrong, and it's the guidelines for people with mental disorders who end up entangled in the law, and it's part of a legal defense where you can claim that you were not guilty due to being insane, meaning so mentally ill that you couldn't appreciate the consequences of your actions, therefore you need to be in a hospital receiving treatment rather than being holed up in a prison or jail. So that's what insanity means. But back then, they looked at people with mental disorders that were going into the prisons and then going into these asylums as they were just insane. They were crazy. They were lunatics. We need to get them out of polite society and into these places where they could be given moral treatment. That was the thought process back in the late 1700s when they started constructing these places. In fact, Eastern State Hospital in Virginia was the very first mental hospital to be built in the United States, and it was I forget exactly what it was called. Let me look it up for you right quick. You would think I would have looked this up before I started this lecture, but sometimes we forget things. Yep, it was constructed in 1773 with a well-intentioned emphasis on community-focused mental health care. It was situated on 500 acres and it consisted of two patient care buildings and a staff of over 900 to care for what was supposed to be 300 patients. So, tell me more about what it was originally called. It was called, I want to say it was Eastern State Hospital. So moral treatment practices, the school of thought which viewed those with mental illness as deserving respect and dignity rather than punishment. That's a thing that we still think about today. We call it trauma-informed care and, treating people with dignity and respect. So back then it was called moral treatment. They had occupational therapy and talk therapy, and they also used laudanum as a calming drug. Now, talk therapy back then was just talking to them and trying to reason with them. But I thought this thing had a different name at the time. Do you know? Well, Let me look it up real quick. It was originally called the Madhouse. That was interesting. They used to call it the Madhouse. But I thought it had a completely different name. Also, they're not even going to talk about the original name. But I imagine it had. Come on, there was an original. It was called the. Come on, it had to have an original name here. Various names were given to this hospital during the years it was called the Madhouse, the Lunatic Hospital, Hospital for the Insane, the Public Hospital, and finally by law the name became the Eastern State Hospital. Okay, so I guess it never did have one of those funny names, but the reason I looked that up is like, okay, in West Virginia, the big Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, right? That's the big haunted attraction in West Virginia next to the Moundsville Penitentiary. And the original name for the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum was the original name for that hospital up until I think in the 1930s is when they changed its name to Weston State Hospital when they adopted the state hospital moniker. But moral treatment, like I said, respect, dignity, occupational therapy, going out in the garden, working out in that, working on the farms, cleaning, sewing, laundry, all of these things were part of what was called moral treatment at the time. Now, there were some unintended consequences as the years went by and more people were diagnosed with mental disorders or neuroses or hysteria and other disorders of the mind. You would see overcrowding occur. So let's just here we go. We'll go with Weston State Hospital, Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum again, just for context, or not even really for context, just to kind of build your idea to it, right? So that hospital is built on 660 some acres. It was original as big as it is. If you've ever been to West Virginia, if you've ever been to Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, as big as that hospital is, it was only designed for maybe 200 to 300 patients overall. But at its peak, it had over 150,000 patients. In fact, that's why they had to build auxiliary buildings on the grounds to house the extra people. So overcrowding became a major problem. Part with overcrowding, you had limited staff, meaning that you had less staff working with the patients than you had patients. So ideally, you want to have 4 to 5 staff per 30 people. So 5 by 30, that's 6. So that's 6 patients per one staff. In the heydays when overpopulation peaked, you might have had maybe 200 or 300 patients per one staff member. That's how overcrowded it used to be. And misunderstandings of mental illness led to cruelty and neglect despite the noble intentions, in fact, of it. I see this sometimes today. You have IDDD patients or you have people with personality disorders and some staff without the understanding of how mental disorders work. If it's psychosis and somebody's so far removed from reality that it's not even funny, that can be mistaken for volitional behavior. And volitional behavior and psychosis are not the same things. Yes, psychosis can drive behavior for sure, but if somebody thinks that Bugs Bunny is talking to them through the television and Bugs Bunny is telling him to go hit somebody, well, he's hitting somebody because he's delusional and having visual hallucinations and auditory hallucinations. It's not a person that's in the same. At that point, that person is so psychotic that they're not in the same scope of reality that we are, that where we know hitting somebody is not a good idea. And so there's that misunderstanding of mental illness there. There's also a misunderstanding of personality disorders, which is a problem in and of itself too, because if you don't understand what a personality disorder is, you might just misattribute that person as just being an asshole for the sake of being an asshole rather than realizing, oh, this person had a traumatic childhood, attachment's been disorganized and completely disrupted, as is normal personality development. So that person's mode of being with the world and their interface with the world at large is completely just mismanaged and disrupted. And so the way they view the world and the way we view the world aren't the same thing either. And that's going to cause problems and misunderstandings as well, which can lead to abuse, such as cursing at patients, yelling at them, threatening them with shots of Benadryl and Haldol, or going into restraints, or going into seclusion, or getting into power struggles when that's totally unnecessary. And all of these things happen because we're all human beings and we all have needs that need to be met, and sometimes we do it in the right. Maybe that's not the right way of thinking of it. We all have things we want and need, and sometimes we will use maladaptive means to get those things met, and other times we use adaptive way to do things. And if you have a mental illness or personality disorder, you use more maladaptive means of getting your needs met than you use adaptive means of getting those needs met. But if you have no understanding of psychology and how human behavior works, then you're going to just attribute it all to just willful volitional behavior, and it's going to lead to resentment, anger, irritability, and power struggles between staff and patients. And that can lead to acts of physical aggression, verbal aggression, and that can get people hurt. And I'm sure that happened in many of these institutions as a consequence of overcrowding, when we're trying to figure out what the hell do we do with people who are mentally ill and are a danger to themselves or others. And that's what they were wrestling with back in the 1700s and the 1800s. They didn't have Thorazine, they didn't have lithium, they didn't have Ativan, Xanax, Valium, and all of that back in those times. So I mean, it was kind of doomed to come to a head no matter what the hell they tried to do. And that's the thing to keep in mind, is despite the noble intentions, these things were bound to happen because human beings are not perfect and things never go exactly the way we want them to or how we plan for them to go. That's the nature of our existence, is nothing ever goes the way we would like it to. We have to adapt. And unfortunately, with these large mental health institutions that we're about, you know, large systems have trouble adapting to dynamic changes because trends in treatment and things would change over time. But the thing that didn't change was everything was changing. Most dramatically was the number of people diagnosed with mental disorders or deemed legally insane and thrown into a mental hospital, which just compounded the problem. Architecture became an ideology in a sense too. So the designs of the asylums reflected the belief that order, symmetry, and beauty could heal the mind at the time. So this was like an early fusion of psychology and architecture. So there's a book I highly recommend reading. Is it here on the shelf somewhere? So I can pull it out. Yes, here it is. Sorry, I had to dip out of frame. Thomas Story Kirkbride was a psychiatrist, and he wrote this book called On the Construction, Organization, and General Arrangements of Hospitals for the Insane. And it was his belief, and I just talked about this, right? That these large, massive structures that had these bat wings laid out in a way that maximized the movement of fresh air and sunlight, the pastel color walls, all of these things would help calm people down, keep them calm, and help restore their sanity. And so Thomas Kirkbride was thinking of human psychology and architecture blending together to help people with mental disorders. And then there are other architects who thought that the big bulky, scary Gothic asylums that haunt our collective mythology, especially after deinstitutionalization and the abandonment of the hospitals, and they gained their haunted reputations. Other architects thought that it would be more practical for smaller buildings to be on a large campus, and they would be interconnected with underground tunnels to make ease of transport of clients, not clients, but the staff. So Penhurst State School is a prime example of a cottage plan. So it's got many buildings on the campus. They're connected by underground tunnels. And so what they would do is if you had a behavioral emergency or some sort of crisis, or what we in the nomenclature today is what we call a response, the response team or the staff that were coming to help assist, they could actually, instead of running outside the buildings or running across campus to get to one of the buildings, they could just go down a flight of stairs, through its tunnels, go to the building they need to do, and they could respond quickly. And to maximize the effectiveness of being able to intervene and minimize any injuries to the clients, the people around the clients, and other staff. So that was the idea as well. If we just have these smaller buildings, you're gonna defeat the overpopulation. So you're not gonna have like thousands of patients in one building, but you can spread them out through several buildings. And then in the 1960s, with the utilitarian plan coming out, I believe it was the 1960s, you had these really large, like modern structures that are like skyscrapers, and they would house anywhere from 400 to 500 patients. And so they thought, well, if instead of making them wider, we'll make them taller, or we'll put them all over the place. Really, they were using architecture and psychology to try to solve problems of, well, how do you keep a bunch of people calm? How do you treat people in an area? And how do you keep from overpopulating? So it's like almost like architecture became the solution to the growing problems that came from as an outgrowth of the overpopulation of the larger asylums that were built around the time that a lot of the Kirkbride hospitals were springing up. And psychology before psychology. So if you've read my psychology, if you've watched my Psychology 101 lectures, you would have, I talk about psychology having its roots in philosophy, and then it has its early roots in early science with looking at physiology, reaction times, and behavior. So before psychology became a science, treatment drew from religion and philosophy, moral discipline to address madness. So it wasn't like one of our favorite evidence-based treatments today with cognitive behavioral therapy, where we can talk to a person and say, okay, well, this happened, you were feeling, okay, you were feeling angry, what were you thinking? Oh, so you thought this when this happened, that made you feel angry, and that motivated you to act this way. So that wasn't a thing back then. Back then it was religion, which we'll get into when we talk about madness in the ancient world, because there's a lot of religion and superstition and mythology that's associated with the development of disorders of the mind in the ancient world. So they would draw from religious thinking, they would draw heavily from philosophy and moral discipline to try to address mental disorder rather than actual therapy, as it were. So the talk therapy that I just talked about, when I was reading a little bit of the history of Eastern State Hospital there in Virginia, that talk therapy was about religious thinking, philosophy, and moral discipline. That was talk therapy at that time, which is not the same thing as the talk therapy we engage in today. So they're worlds apart. They're not just time periods apart. They're worlds apart of what we do today. And the asylum is a cultural symbol. So they embody both sanctuary and punishment. They were a reflection of society's ambivalence toward mental illness. So I imagine back in the 17 and 1800s, people who were muttering to themselves, talking about devils and demons and spirits and God knows what else, because, you know, the FBI, CIA, and all that. Because that's an interesting thing, eh? It seems to me the more I read about the history of certain mental illnesses like schizophrenia and delusions, it's almost like the delusional content that was talked about at the time that these books were written is a reflection of the culture. So Jung, for example, had a lot of people with schizophrenia that he treated in his Berlioz hospital there in Switzerland. And a lot of their delusions and visions and hallucinations all had a mythological and religious component, and that makes sense because during Jung's time, Switzerland was a very religious culture. And so I would say that the psychoses of the people reflected the culture of the time in which they lived. Today, in the world of conspiracy theories and the deep state and mistrust of government agencies, a lot of the delusions that I hear about, especially among those with paranoia, it surrounds the FBI, the CIA, the government, men in black, aliens, and all of that sort of stuff. So it's really rooted in that culture of conspiracy theory that we're kind of immersed in today. And really, I think have been immersed in since the 1960s, because I think there were a lot of conspiracy theories back then about like who really killed JFK. And so I'm sure there was a lot of that permeating the psychoses of people that were mentally ill in the 1960s. And that's a, culture does affect psychosis in a sense, if you and it does make sense. And so, but really, was it an ambivalence? Well, I would imagine for some people, it is ambivalence to try to ignore that which they don't understand. I mean, ask yourself this: if you've ever walked in a city and you've seen somebody talking to themselves or acting in a manner that would be described as bizarre, do you ignore them out of fear? Do you just not care one way or the other and just worry about getting to your destination? Do you stop and stare out of morbid fascination? Do you try to talk to them out of care and compassion? Like, really put yourself in that position. Imagine yourself walking down the street and you see somebody that's acting out the sort of behaviors that are associated with severe mental illness, and what would you do? Maybe, and we could talk about that, right? Would you run away afraid? Would you walk quickly out of fear of making eye contact? Would you just walk by and just simply ignore them because you don't care? Would you go up and talk to them and say, "Hey, what's going on?" Something to really think about. Influences from literature and art. So, I've talked about previously, H.P. Lovecraft and Arkham Asylum, Gothic artists have really shaped our imagery of the asylums of these mysterious and terrifying places. And even on television, when you watch like Ghost Adventures or Ghost Hunters, um, Project Fear, any of the big paranormal TV shows where they go to these old mental hospitals, they describe them as these imposing structures with this horrible dark history where all these atrocious things happened and the dead are still acting as if they're still imprisoned in a functioning hospital. And I mean, the way they describe it is very dark and scary. The artwork that we see is pretty dark and scary. Even when you read the history and they talk about the unpleasant stuff, it reads dark and scary. And that is the collective description of human imagination ever since these structures were built in the 1700s. I think a lot of that is because we were also scared of people with mental disorders, and I would say that there was a fear that people had that they would develop something like this, and this is where they would end up. I mean, there was a mass hysteria in the 1800s where people were afraid that they were going to get snatched off and sent to the loony bin for any reason and be completely, perfectly mentally healthy. I mean, when you shut your eyes and you just do this exercise, just close your eyes for a few minutes and just imagine, just think of the word asylum and just let your imagination run. And what comes to mind? What do you see? I imagine you probably see a very large, imposing structure that absolutely scares the bloody pants off of you. And that's what we've kind of imagined these asylums to be. Echoes in modern psychiatry. We've had deinstitutionalization, and we've reframed these things as just relics of the past, and yet we still need humane long-term care for patients that have severe mental illness. In fact, this cartoon here, I think, says it all. We have a plan that will save even more money, right? It's always these goddamn bureaucrats that think they know what they're doing. And so they empty the patients out of the state mental hospitals and they end up in homeless shelters, jail, private hospitals, nursing homes, and I want to say, I want to say that looks like dumpsters, but I don't think that's exactly right. But that's what happens. The jails and prisons have become the new mental hospitals because a lot of inmates and prisoners that find themselves there got entangled with the law and they're in states that don't have mental hospitals and guilty by reason of insanity so that you can get treatment rather than go to prison. So you're in prison in a cell whilst taking medication and going to see a mental health provider in the jail or prison. Many of them end up in homeless shelters because they decompensate or they can't be compliant with their medication regimen, so they're constantly in cycles of being well and ill, so there's no stability, so they can't be off of the streets by their own for whatever reason. If it's because they can't afford the medications because the goddamn things are so expensive, it's sad. Private hospitals, they'll go there if they're lucky to be able to have a place to get stabilized, or they end up in the nursing homes after they reach a certain age. And so, yeah, the mental hospitals may be a relic of the past, but at least they did serve a noble purpose in one form or another, despite all of the problems that came from that. So here's some things to think about. I have these discussion questions because I am making this like I said, a signature class that I could teach at a college or university if I'm lucky enough. So here's some questions to think about, and you can feel free to put your answers in the comments. I will read the comments when it comes to this stuff. How does the concept of the asylums differ across history? So you could do some of your own digging and you could talk about that. Or in what ways did the early intentions of the reforms fail? So we could argue overpopulation and lack of staffing is one major fail. Or deinstitutionalization was a fail because a lot of folks ended up in homeless shelters or they ended up in jails and prisons. That's a pretty big failure. And do we see any parallels that exist between the 19th century asylums and, say, today's modern institutions? I think these are three questions that are really worth sitting there thinking about for at least a couple of weeks, and maybe we can have a conversation about that. Also have a weekly reflection prompt. This is more for if I was teaching this as an actual in-person class, but hey, why not? You could put this here in the comment section too. If you reflect on the tension between progress and cruelty in the early mental health institutions, what can modern practitioners learn from this paradox? And that means, the contradiction between noble intentions and moral treatment and overcrowding, neglect, abuse, and experimentation when we didn't have thank God we have ethics now that we can't do things like they did back in the day when they were trying to figure out how you even treat mental illness. So moral treatment and what actually happened, I guess you could say, is one big bloody paradox. So talk about the tension between that. So the next lecture that I plan on uploading, hopefully this one goes, this lecture that I'm just putting on here will go well, and that's looking at madness in the ancient world and exploring the spiritual, shamanic, and philosophical origins of mental illness in the ancient world. So long before the mental institutions, the poorhouses, the jails, and the prisons, madness was also prevalent, or mental illness was prevalent in the ancient world, and we'll talk about and explore that to some degree. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Like I said, there's those questions that I put up in that reflection prompt, so feel free to put answers to those or talk about them in the comments. and I'll see you guys back here next week talking about madness in the ancient world.